Hey guys, it's Bex. I'm here in Montreal, Canada, because I have one question I really need the answer to. How do you make the scariest video game? Let's go find out.
But why Montreal, you may ask? Well, the Canadian city is the home of Red Barrels, the developers behind one of gaming's most horrifying franchises, the Outlast series. Since the release of Outlast 1 almost 10 years ago, the series has been scaring Xbox players silly by plunging them into nightmarish settings without a weapon in sight. Just some batteries, a night vision camera, and their wits is all they have to survive. I was lucky enough to sit down with the devs, plus play the newly announced level with the studio co-founder and game director, Philippe Morin, in the hopes that they could answer my question. How do you make the perfect horror game?
Oftentimes, what scares us is the unknown.
Players, they are not afraid of the dark, they are afraid of what's within the dark.
Our horror is very different in a way. We don't rely on aliens, monsters and stuff. We really rely on people and their true natures.
When you're making a game, there's always people asking, why would they do this? Why would they do that? And very often the most realistic answer would just be, well, because they can.
With brand new gameplay and the insight of those who made it, here's our preview of the Outlast Trials and a deep dive into how horror is crafted. For those who haven't had their briefing yet, the Outlast Trials is set in a facility run by the ethically dubious Murkoff Corporation. In the game, you run through certain scenarios and maps with different objectives to complete, solving puzzles and annoying, terrifying enemies along the way. With levels including a police station and an orphanage, players must run through a physical and psychological gauntlet with the aim of being reborn by the facility. You can play with up to 4 players at once, entirely in co-op. I played it solo, 2-player, and 4-player to get the full experience, including the new Toy Factory location. After I was sufficiently scarred, I sat down with senior level designer Daniel Dedus and level design director Samuel Barnier, then assistant character art director Hugo Richard, and Red Barrel's co-founder Philippe Morin to chat all about the game and horror gaming in general. It is my favourite topic after all, so I had to kick it off with my biggest question.
What to you is the most important thing about making a terrifying horror game?
Oh boy, the most important thing.
The pacing and the player anticipation. We want to create a pacing where the player can anticipate what's coming up in the next room or like in the dark and something like that. So we create like a downtime moment and we hint the player like some kind of maybe like dead bodies and like there's something coming up next and you want to make him feel scared.
A motivation and a lot of pleasure to make people uncomfortable. Yeah, you gotta have fun coming up with those ideas. Honestly, sometimes we censor ourselves a bit. Sometimes some of these ideas go too far, but yeah, we just find it very fun to come up with stuff that makes people uncomfortable and obviously make them scream.
Thank you for the censorship. That's really appreciated.
And for all you morbidly curious creatures out there, don't worry, we'll get to what the creator of Outlast considers too far later. But back to the level designer Dan.
There's a fair amount of terror and tension we tend to like to focus on. So you might have a moment of tension, which is basically like walking into a dark area, not knowing what's there. And oftentimes, what scares us is the unknown, right? So we'll try to focus, depending on what the objectives and the maps are, we'll make sure to really have a pacing which, focuses partly in some parts on lower tension, higher tension, but there's also the aspect of terror.
Sorry. Oh my gosh. I'm losing my head.
So the aspect of terror would be those moments where you're either being chased or, it's absolute chaos and you're terrified.
Okay.
Playing around with those two ultimately will make a really good horror experience.
Oh, Gooseberry's in here! No, she see me! Run! So Phil, how did you decide on which common fears that people have that you were going to draw on?
Honestly, those elements that we put in the game come from members of the team. Horror can be very subjective, and one thing that can be really scary to somebody and not for somebody else. Tapping into some things that are maybe more common, other things that may be more personal. Like I remember in Outlast 2, we had the sequence of you being in the water. So for some people, being in the water and not knowing what's underneath the water was really scary. For the people, it was just, I just have to keep moving and swimming. Same thing with corridor. People get more scared in a corridor-esque kind of layout. With the cornfields we did in Outlast 2 were really scary for some people, not as much for others. So yeah, we started with those concepts, and then, you know, it just evolves, and there's a lot of exchange within the team. Like people come up with ideas, hey, why not do this, why not do that? And usually when somebody says, are we really gonna do this? That's a good sign. You know, that's, yeah, let's keep exploring that.
The characters of Outlast Trials, or rather the enemies you'll be forced to contend with, undoubtedly have a huge role in the scares too. We'll get to the how they were designed later, but first I wanted to know from assistant character art director Hugo what he thinks makes them so frightening.
What makes those characters scary for us is how we really implement them into the environment, the way they act around the environment, and visually what I like to put into it is how tangible they feel in terms of realism. Like you could see Gooseberry as an actual person in real life. So to me, this is what makes it quite scary. Our horror is very different in a way. We don't rely on aliens, monsters and stuff. We really rely on people and their true natures.
The topic of the true nature of humanity is something that comes up pretty consistently within the Outlast games, and it's not a pretty picture, and only adds to the feel of unease and eerie atmosphere. And just like all of the scariest things, it's got some pretty alarming connections to real life. I'd love to know what inspired Outlast Trials, where you drew inspiration from, maybe also how Montreal, where we are just now, inspired you too.
Back in the days, the McGill University had Dr. Cameron working on some behavior control stuff, and the CIA got interested, and they basically funded him for a while to keep experimenting on people. And the reason why we called our lobby the sleep room is because the building where he was doing those experiments was also called the sleep room. The MK Ultra program had a lot to do with how to modify people and getting the truth out of them. That's how I started, if I'm not wrong. Now trying to use LSD to see if they could make prisoners talk and make them say whatever. In our case, no, we're turning reagents into sleeper agents. There was also the Stanford prison experiment. That was, I think, end of the 60s. And so at university, they took a group of people, they split them into prisoners and guards, and just to see what would happen. And that was supposed to last 2 weeks and only lasted 6 days because all hell broke loose. And that's when you see that when people are giving freedom of use their authority any way they can, they tend to abuse it. Same thing with the Milgram experiment. Where they would have a volunteer come up and ask questions to somebody they couldn't see. And if that person gave the wrong answer, they would have to give them electroshock. And each question, they would have to raise the level of intensity of the electroshock, not knowing that, no, they were not really given electroshock. But the fact that somebody told them to do it made most of these people feel unresponsible to what they were doing, so they just kept on asking questions and giving electroshock. So all these things, all these concepts and ideas were floating around. We did have to do a lot of research, and we consulted a psychiatrist to help us define how do we turn all that into a trial. We had to crank it up to 11 to turn this into an Outlast game.
An Outlast game, this absolutely is. Even though you don't have a camera for your night vision anymore, your visor is conveniently bolted onto your forehead. You can still feel the DNA of the CDs and even some recurring characters running through it. But there's one obvious difference from the other two games. This can be a shared co-op experience, which, should in theory make things less scary, right? How different was it, and how difficult was it
to come up with an experience that was terrifying for both solo and cooperative players, up to 4 players.
Coming up with a co-op version of Outlast was quite a challenge. That's why it took us 6 years, to ship the early access. We made a lot of prototypes, made a lot more than just one game in those 6 years. We got a lot of ideas on the back burner we hope we can do later. We did start prototyping with 4 players in mind, but then we realized pretty soon that the game worked as well when you played 3, 2, or even solo. So we just decided moving forward that we would be supporting all these different options.
The previous Outlast were like in single player, so the path of the player is like fixed, so you know exactly where the player will be. You can say, okay, when he passes this door, his camera will be in front of him, you can scare him. In Trials, it's co-op, so you never know where like another player can be, so you cannot, like, I will say, cheat like the scare factor.
When you're making a single player story-driven game, it's basically you're moving from one trigger to another, and as developers we control exactly what happens and when it happens. For this game we had to come up with new ways and new systems to create jump scares without the players knowing when they're going to happen.
We cannot create a fake jump scare, like there's an enemy waiting around the corner and like he pop in your face and stuff like that. We cannot do this because like another player can like look into that direction and stuff like that. So
basically what we do is that the level designers place, I don't know, 100 Jack-in-the-Box instances in each level, and then when the level loads we make a few of those appear, and then we have some probability happening under the hood to decide which one is going to make you a jump scare.
Controlling where a moment of tension or terror is, or horror, for one player might be different from another just based off of location, right? So it was important in those moments to see how we can really group people up together in certain moments and how we make sure that everyone's sort of experiencing that together.
There's a basic structure that remains the same for one specific trial, but there's a lot of random stuff happening from one game to another. The enemies won't be exactly the same, they won't be at the same spot, the items will be in different places, the objectives will be in different places, so the structure of the trial remains the same, but the way you're going to execute and succeed is going to be different from one game to another.
One thing that remains pretty consistent within the scenarios are what the team call the prime assets. They're the big bads of each level, currently made up of the puppet-wielding Mother Gooseberry and the electroshock fan, Officer Coil.
Gooseberry and Coil are basically a mother and a father figure.
You upset Daddy?
Very up one, but that's kind of how we approached it. And she's more of a loosey-goosey, everything is permitted. Yeah, if somebody pisses you off, just kill them and whatever.
You've been expressing anger in the therapy.
Everything Mother does is love.
Mother Gooseberry design was inspired by our writer, actually. Like everything that we do kind of comes from him. At first, he mentioned that he wanted someone kind of jolly from afar, but the more like the closer you look at it, they're like, there's something wrong with this. And she has a very twisted personality at the same time. She has a very violent force, I should say. One of the big inspirations for Gooseberry was Mist Up Fire, and how, like a big of a personality she is. I did 3 different variations for her. The first one was a bit too off-putting. The second one was already too horror-ish. So we wanted like something in between, like a very horrific person and like a normal person at the same time. Because Gooseberry, she is a dual character. She has Mr. Fireman, which is her personality, and her, which is very charming, calm in a way. And we wanted to kind of play with that visually speaking.
Do I have something in my tea?
Coil is more like, no, there has to be structure, there has to be law, as long as it benefits him and his power trip.
But the truth, so help you God. Y'all are all equal under the law.
Coil has a very specific horror element to him. He is a police officer that comes with already a lot of elements that we can play with, just with brute force and all of those things. But visually, we wanted to play with a lot of his internal pleasures in a way, because she's very out there. Koyo is the total opposite. Koyo is angry most of the time, but he also has these kinks for wait, this is bad.
Flagellation.
I mean, how can I properly put that?
I think that's Koyo. Someone else is definitely here as well.
He has a fascination for electricity, and you can see on his skin that he on purpose, he keeps shocking himself everywhere. He likes to play with mannequins, and through that we tell a story for him and his design and the things that he does around the environment.
When designing a character, what often comes first? Do you look at their shape or their clothes or their identity? What's the starting point?
Whenever I'm starting to think about a character design, first and foremost is narrative, to see how a writer is thinking about those characters. And the second thing, most important aspect also, is gameplay. What do we want to do with it? And then from there, I can ask, okay, what type of guns they use? Guns, weapons, what are the kinds of elements we want to explore in terms of gameplay? Do they want to be snipers? Do they want to be night hunters, for example? So after I have this type of information, I start designing some silhouettes, quick sketches where we can show a little bit of the vibe for the character, how we could play with any sort of horrific skin deformation and stuff. Before moving forward with this, we sit and we check all of the sketches that I did to see what are the elements that we like from all of them, and we put everything together afterwards.
The game is filled with mutated horrors, from test subjects to grunts. What is it that makes all of your enemies so scary?
How tangible those characters feel in a real situation. Because Barry could be a person that you see nowadays. So is Koyo. So I think to me this is really terrifying.
So if you want to make great horror characters, you need to make them feel tangible and realistic and tell a story through their design and actions. An inversion on something jolly or protective, like parents or a puppet, makes sure that the character has that uncanny valley factor too. But the environment this prime assets chase you through are just as much about the character as they are. So I asked the level designers how to make the environments as oppressive, but still fun as possible. And Dan gave me a very Outlast coded answer.
I think there's multiple ways to skin a cat, right? It's a saying we like to use around here very often. Don't worry, there's no animals that were harmed in the making of this game. Essentially, there's many ways to go about making a map aesthetically scary. And one thing that we often do here is something called anti-design. So when it comes to, for example, layouts, we'll say, okay, you need an open space, you know, it needs to breathe. Well, we'll have moments where we'll actually put you in a very confined space and make you feel that aspect of claustrophobia, uncomfortableness. There's also the aspect of lighting versus dark. In other scenarios or in other games, design might tell you, go towards the light. That's where you need to go. In our case, sometimes it might be, hey, you need to go into the dark. And that's sort of part of the aesthetic. So we work with a lot of anti-design.
We like to pay attention to details. We place our stuff carefully in a map or gameplay ingredients, so for example, the items and stuff like that. And one thing that we notice a lot when we play tests or maps is even the most obvious objective, the most obvious thing the player needs to do are missed, like when they're scared. So for example, you can have a door, like the objective is go through that door, and you see the door, but you watch them play and they can't see it and they missed it. And so we make sure that we pace our map in a way that when the player needs to understand something, when the players needs to notice something very important, we create a downtime.
Right, we need to get into the security room to turn that on to open the door.
We try not to use too many words. So you'll have, for example, your mission, which is more of an explicit thing. Okay, go here, go there. You'll have the implicit, which will be sort of more within the narrative storytelling. So whether it be dead bodies that are scattered across, meaning, hey, someone was here before. And then there's also the emergence, and that's basically the gaps that we allow the player to create in their own mind. One of the first things that we take into account usually is who are the prime assets? And how do they fit in this potential environment that we give them? Usually we kind of go about building a level that we think would, for one, be fitting within the prime asset and would upset the prime asset. So anything we do is sort of, off the prime asset, so to speak. And then you would also have the other aspect where whatever it is that you're doing, we always make sure when we're designing a level that we're thinking, what does Murkoff want you to do, and how do we make you do something that you are totally uncomfortable with doing?
That question leads on to a huge reason why the Outlast Trials is terrifying, and it's not quite what you'd expect. You see, the objectives in the trials often involve causing somebody else real-life harm, like electrifying a snitch or covering a living person in wax. Actually, Phil has a better example.
You know, we have an MK challenge where you have to bring kid mannequins to a van. And one of the player was really uncomfortable, like I don't want to be doing this. And then the other players were like just screaming at her, you have to do it, otherwise we're not going to progress. And they're like, they didn't care about the context and all that. Just do it. And she was like, I don't want to. It's to me, I find that moment, being able to create that moment, that interaction between players is very, very interesting as a game designer.
Whether you're braving it solo or with others on Xbox or crossplay, the Outlast Trials is really very interested in making you interrogate your own humanity. It's what Phil spoke about earlier with the real-life psychological experiment examples of what inspired the game. Will you really do what you're told, even if it's to cause harm to another innocent person?
Tell me you're not gonna do this.
And so we always want to put that sort of misery, that pain, that sort of like emotional feeling into the player of asking themselves constantly, are my morals okay? Is it okay for me to be doing this? But at the end of the day, if you want to escape the trials, you gotta do the work.
You guys are gross.
In fact, Hugo even ambushed me with a deep philosophical question at the end of our chat.
How did you feel killing all these people at the end?
I was so busy rushing through the levels that I didn't even really think about it. I was just doing objectives and wasn't that fussed about really the actions behind what I was doing in that very moment or what those consequences were.
And that's exactly it. You surprise yourself with how far you're willing to go just because Murkoff and the trials tell you to. You may have that Xbox gamepad in your hands and not be in the actual game, but the immersion mixed with these difficult moral questions completely messes with the perception of yourself, which is another level of why the Outlast Trials is so scary.
Experience has taught me one truth about the human limits of terror and pain. There are none.
You can't trust yourself, and you can't even trust what you're seeing either because of the psychosis mechanic. At times in the game, either in the environment or through an enemy spraying you with gas, you'll suffer from psychosis, which completely changes the world around you. You start seeing things, but when you're playing in co-op specifically, it can really trip you up by either completely disorientating your voice comms or even having an imposter replica of your teammate randomly stab you. But personally, the worst of it all has to be the Skinner Man.
The Skinner Man is our boogeyman. Nothing is real. It's your version of what is horror in the Outlast Trials.
The psychosis effect is something that was added to the project very, very early on. The notion of what is real and behavior modification and make you lose your mind, it's definitely something that's been part of the brand since the beginning. We did that a lot in Outlast 2 with the swapping between Temple Gate and the school and not knowing what is real and what is not. So I think it's a key element of the MK Ultra project that the CIA did back in the 60s.
So in case you're keeping score at home, here's what you need to make the perfect horror game. based very loosely on real life, if possible, tangible Uncanny Valley characters, anti-design, messing with players' perception of the environment and themselves, a perfect balance between tension and terror, all mixed with a desire to make players uncomfortable. Oh, which reminds me.
Okay, can you give me an example of something that you have left out that is maybe a step too far?
Probably the biggest thing is that, are we using a real child or mannequin child? That's where we decided to draw the line. Even though at the end of the day, it's all polygons. It's all polygons moving. So whether it's a wooden mannequin or a child, it's all the rest. The difference is in your mind.
Well, there we have it. That's the line. And how Outlast Trials could have been even more disturbing. Before our time is up, I would be remiss if I didn't ask what other scares the Red Barrels team had in store for Outlast Trials in the future. And I'll let Phil fill you in. But before I leave you, let me know in the comments what makes a perfect horror game for you. And subscribe for more dev interviews and early previews. Take it away, Phil.
The progression has completely been revamped. So you get a lot more content, trials, MK challenges, a lot more of everything else, perks, amps, prescriptions, upgrades for rigs, customization. We've done a lot of balancing using players' feedback, and that's why we did the early access. Basically a lot more of everything, and hopefully even better. We have a new release ending, and I think the fans of Outlast 1 are going to be really pleased about this one. It has a lot of ties with what happens in Outlast 1. Excited to see how players react to it.
This is exciting.